My name's Jack. I actually lead the investment management team here at Goodman Masson. So I specifically focus on fund investments and manager selection mandates for clients ranging from asset owners, asset managers and advisors. As an agency who specialise within investment management recruitment specifically, we've seen the demand in ESG focused roles increase quite dramatically over the last 12 months. Whether or not that's for an asset owner, such as a pension fund, for an asset manager investing in their ESG infrastructure. Many of these roles have sort of tended to be for ESG specialists or an expansion of a, albeit smaller team of specialists. So, for example, in my area of sort of manager research, ESG has tended to sort of comprise around a third of a researcher's role responsibility. This has sort of evolved over time, utilising of internal resources. However, through that increased sort of demand, we're seeing resources have become certainly sort of stretched and limited. So clients now are bringing on external ESG specialists who or creating internal opportunities for fully focused roles within the area. The external hires have tended to be for more senior profiles, such as sort of heads of ESG research, for someone to sort of take the lead and effectively build an ESG and responsible investing capabilities. So as we sort of see that area evolved and those positions of new leadership look to expand their team, we certainly expect to see the more junior to mid-level mandates coming through, perhaps towards Q4 or into 2022. Now, in what is sort of an important and evolving space, we thought best to hold an event to discuss what an ESG career looks like now, and well, that comes in the form of a webinar because there's no other way. So we brought together 3 leaders here today in the space who have recently joined or recently moved their focus of their career into more of an ESG and responsible investing. So they're going to today discuss with them how they've got to where they are in their careers, provide any advice for anyone who's interested in following a similar pathway. So today we'll focus on kind of 3 core areas: where they've got to where in their careers now through introductions, how ESG is actually evolving, and advice for anyone who really wants more exposure within ESG within their career. So yeah, we also have time at the end where people have sent through some questions that we'll get our panelists to answer. And if you do have any questions, any of the attendees that are here today, please do email me afterwards, and I'll make sure they get looked at. So look, I want to do as minimal talking as possible because you're not here for me. But yeah, without any further ado, I'll let our speakers introduce themselves and I guess start with the discussions about how they got to where they are in their career, and then we'll sort of move on from there. So Jen, did you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone, I'm Jennifer Bishop and I'm a portfolio manager and head of ESG at the Coal Pension Fund, which is a £20 billion closed defined benefit retirement scheme for all of the people who worked in coal mining, mostly through the 70s and 80s. So I have not been there long, so I moved to coal in October last year, which was off the back of my maternity leave with my 3rd child, and I found that time off a good time to reflect on what I wanted to do going forward, and I had an interesting choice between at WTW, which is the global consultant I was at before. I was very much focused on ESG as well, but it was a very different role, thinking about either looking to move a very, very large pool of assets, but perhaps move it a smaller amount versus having a dedicated ESG title and mandate and trying more to build a portfolio from scratch, and having something smaller and maybe less of a global impact, but actually being able to, see more change shorter term. So I made the move over to coal in October last year, and it's just been a very interesting comparison. So I originally came onto ESG and being interested in that from my previous role. I was finding high return investments across the spectrum, and I ended up finding lots of investments I really liked, which ended up being somewhat linked to ESG but not deliberately, and lots of investments I really didn't like and didn't want us to do, and they were from often an ESG perspective as well, but we didn't have a framework for saying yes or no to those things, and quite often we were coming down to quite personal discussions on people's morals and ethics and beliefs, and they're conversations which can be really interesting but perhaps not helpful. So coming up with a framework to make some of those decisions and know what everyone's views were was where I started, and became really interested.
Okay, great. Andrew?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm Andrew Lilley, and I'm head of ESG research at ISEO. And I'll cover my transition to ESG in a second. But I think in embarking on a career as an ESG professional, I do think it's quite important to be clear on the why you want to be involved in ESG. And there's quite a few reasons that I've seen for getting into this space. It might be to have a career better aligned with your values. It's might be that it's a dynamic and really fast moving space that's growing. So there's a lot of longevity in your career. And it might be that you want to be a bit of a revolutionary and upend traditional finance, which certainly ESG is doing at the moment. I would say when going for a new job in ESG, it is important to remember that values point. I mean, it's the number one reason for me, and it is actually prominently on my CV, although not all of it. Just to kind of explain the context of that, I've always done a lot of charity work. I spend Christmas working in homeless shelters. I started a vegan food business on the side alongside my finance job, mainly for environmental reasons. And I've even logged into my work emails on top of Waterloo Bridge when the Extinction Rebellion stuff was going on. So I would say on your CV, have the right balance, but do mention your values, because that shows that you have the passion to work 10, 12-hour days in ESG, but also be clear that you're prepared to work within the financial system, not tear it down. So have that balance, but don't forget your values. And then very briefly, how I made the transition. Well, a bit of background on ISEO is it's an advisory business, and I sit on the investment advisory side, where a lot of professionals have a mix of roles, like you were describing, Jack. So we're primarily client facing with a research allocation. So it's commonly 80% client, 20% research. And I was always quite heavily involved in client side, but I would say there was always something missing there. I did have really good client relationships and I enjoyed getting to know my clients. But outside of doing a good job for my clients, there was a really strong realization that I didn't feel I was making much of a difference to the world. And so I got involved in ESG research. And because the head of the ESG team back in the day was just run off her feet, there were more projects than she could service. I became really valuable in that team. And she left just over a year ago. And so the head of ESG came up, and a lot of people did apply to it. And I think the reason I was successful in getting it and making a complete shift to where I'm nearly 100% working on ESG is because I was a prominent part of the team. So I disseminated a lot of knowledge in a really short time. But people knew my values. They knew I was a vegan animal rights campaigner. They knew I was constantly raising for charity through marathons or volunteering, and they thought I had credibility in that space. And I think that credibility point is really important. And just a final message is that even if you're not going for a 100% ESG role at the moment, I have never heard of an ESG professional who's got too little work. So if your company has an RI team, there will be opportunities if you're interested to get stuck in. And this is a great way to get in a career in ESG.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Finally, Hannah.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you. It's my pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you today. And I'm really pleased to go third, because actually some of what Jen and what Andrew have introduced through their presentation really resonates very well with me. So to align with Jen, I started out at an investment consulting firm many years ago in my career. And to align with some of the comments Andrew just made, I recently moved into sustainable investment. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that transition in a moment, but I wanted to highlight that the considerations that I'd used, Andrew, were exactly aligned with what you were saying. So aligning with your values, absolutely the desire to move into a very fast-paced, dynamic part of the business as well. So I am Hannah Simons. I'm Head of Sustainability Strategy at Schroders. Schroders is a global asset manager, and today we manage over 550 billion of assets for our clients globally. That's across equities, fixed income, and multi-asset. And at Schroders, we've been embedding sustainability into our investment process for more than 20 years. And I'll come back to talk about that in just a moment. But if I might explain how I've ended up being part of the dedicated sustainable investment team. I mentioned that I started my career as an investment consultant. That was also with, back then it was Watson Wyatt, now it's Willis Towers Watson. And aligning with those values points, my first research role with Watson Wyatt back then was a member of the ethical ask, and that's what they call their research teams, areas of specialist knowledge. And the reason I highlight that is it helps reinforce just how significant and dramatic the shift around sustainability has been, because 20 years ago, it was limited to very heavy screening around moral views that were because you were a charity or purpose-led investor. They were the only clients that you talked to about sustainability. And in fact, of course, you weren't using that term, you were talking about ethical investing. And then things moved on a little to focus not just on that negative side, but on those more positive elements, so best in class, and then responsible investing, sustainable investing became the terms that we know and love today. So I spent many years after I left Watson Wyatt. I've been involved in the asset management industry for that entire period, focusing mainly on delivering solutions for clients. So I've been part of the multi-asset teams here at Schroders, but also I spent some time at BlackRock and PIMCO as well along the way. But about 2 years ago, I started thinking about what next? What's the next stage in my career? And I went through that thought process that aligned so well with what Andrew was talking about when you are looking at it, introspectively and saying, what is it I want to do? And so I had my personal beliefs and values around sustainability, but I truly also believed that asset managers play a critical role in delivering a more sustainable future or more sustainable outcome for not only our clients, but clearly broader society. And I recognised all the work that Schroders had been doing for many years and wanted to be part of what I considered to be a new paradigm or a new focus for clients in the next period of investing. So a role came up, I applied internally. And again, similar to Andrew, other people applied. It was a very difficult sort of selection process. I had to do as many interviews as I would have done if I was an external candidate. I was interviewed by the entire team. I had to present to them all. They had to pretend to be trustees and financial advisors, and I had to be the expert on climate change. Incredibly daunting, but I got through that process, and I've now been in the role since the beginning of last year, so 15 months on, and I have just absolutely embraced the challenge. There's something new every day. There are competing demands, and we can talk about in the next section regulations and what's fueling this. But it has been the most amazing experience of my career, and I feel very lucky to have already had a long and successful career that I've truly enjoyed every moment of. So to find and to be part of a new era that is ever more exciting has just been wonderful for me.
I think that's great. You've got sort of two people who have both sort of made those sort of internal moves into ESG, and then someone who's obviously moved externally to start something in its first instances. So that's really interesting. I'd like to move us on to sort of a kind of a roundtable discussion between you three now in terms of how you've seen sort of ESG evolve, how thoughts on sort of the impact and wider industry, and just a kind of a general discussion for our guests today. About sort of ESG in general and any of the evolving sort of changes that you're seeing. So did you want to start us off, Andrew?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the important thing, how is ESG changing? I mean, the ESG journey isn't done. It hasn't even got started yet. It's, I don't know what you'd say, the end of the beginning. I think the way it's going to evolve is it's going to become a more complete evaluation of ESG risks and opportunities. This is sort of that third dimension of traditional finance, not just risk and return, but that third dimension of ESG impact. And I think what needs to happen, the key areas of development is that there has to be a better value assigned to the positive or negative impacts a company has on the environment and the society in that it operates. And at the moment, I mean, it's really not done comprehensively. So it's really early days in this. Some of the assessments are really qualitative in nature. They don't have robust numbers behind it. Others that do have certain kind of quant frameworks in place might be really specific. And the one that you'll see mentioned all the time is climate change risk. And a lot of clients are getting better at analysing climate change risk, but will completely ignore others, like risk of biodiversity loss. So what will change and what will evolve? Well, I think two things: data. I think the quality of data will become better, but also how asset owners, how investors, how consultants like I am, how they use data to make investment decisions. So the data point, I think, will evolve really quickly. And then secondly, I think the standardization of valuation frameworks will get better as well. So again, with climate change, the reason why climate change is more advanced, apart from the urgency of the climate change issue, is that we've got the TCFD, the Task Force on Financial Related Climate Disclosures. Sorry, it's a bit of a mouthful, but that's becoming a global framework for climate risk valuation. But broader than this, we've got the Accounting Standards Board, the IFRS. It's quite recently launched the SSB, a Sustainability Standards Board. That's just a more going to become a fuller way to standardize E, S, and G valuations, and I think that's the way ESG is going.
Jen?
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe just to touch on one of the things that's changing the fastest is pricing. So, you know, if you were talking 5 or maybe longer years ago, you'd have to make a real case for, okay, investing on this basis looks bad on all historical measures, but we really think it will change in future. Whereas now we're on the other end of that and we're talking about, oh, is this the latest bubble? Are these things already so bid up that it doesn't make sense to do anything? So I think the move in pricing has been exciting and really interesting, and it just shows how much things change, how much sentiment has changed, how much regulation has driven things, and then also why there's always so much work to do, because there's always a different technology, a different piece of regulation, a different thing that's doing well or not well. So I think it keeps it really interesting, but it also means you never run out of things to do. So, you know, somebody can always, you know, whether it's a junior person in the firm or someone you're interviewing, can always come up with something you haven't thought of yet or think of it in a different way. So I think the pricing is really interesting. I guess the other thing that maybe is changing a bit, but maybe not as much as you'd hope, is you still get a wide range of perspectives on this, and it still can be really incendiary for people. I mean, in a lot of our industry, you still have, you know, trustees make decisions, and trustees might have very, very different views than young ESG focused professionals. So one thing that I find I have to keep evolving is methods of persuasion. So I really, you have your own values, but they're not going to convince everyone. In fact, they might just make people angry. It can be the same as having a conversation on Brexit. So it's coming up with things that might be persuasive that you might think are a bit cheap, like doing something just for money's sake or risk reduction's sake. But it's changing your argument to suit who you're trying to convince.
Okay. Hannah?
Thank you. If I may add and sort of complement what Jen and Andrew have already talked about, as an asset manager and making investment decisions, I talked about in my introductory comments that critical role that we play in basically how we deploy capital. And if we think about the enormity of the challenge, and this can get right to the heart of why is it that people are talking about sustainability now? And many of you who are joining today will be incredibly familiar with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And these are the 17 goals that represent a blueprint for a sort of better outcome for people and the planet in the long term. And there are estimates around how much capital needs to be deployed in order that we can actually meet those goals. And the UN's estimates are that we need something like $5 to $7 trillion a year. Wow. Until 2030 to actually bring about the changes that we need to do. And so if you think about from that investment-led perspective, if that's the amount of capital that needs to move, the investment opportunities that come with that are really significant. And I definitely hear what Jen has to say about that bubble. It's not just about investing in the people that are there today. It is going on that journey with the organisations that today aren't already sustainable or are, their products aren't particularly aligned to the UN SDGs. But you can go on that journey, and then that I think will lead to some great returns rather than just buying the ones that are really expensive already. So we have the opportunity, along with the entire investment industry, to support that transition to those more sustainable futures. And then to start bringing in some of the comments that Andrew was making, you can't possibly divorce the sort of financial piece from the sustainability piece. You have to bring them together. And again, that's the way in which Schroders has approached sustainability. So we've developed over 20 years a number of tools. None of them give an answer, none of them give a magic number, but together and collectively they provide a framework that allows our analysts and portfolio managers to really consider the extent to which sustainability may represent a risk or an opportunity. Remember, it's those two sides, it's risk and opportunity, to deliver those more sustainable outcomes. So that's why this is gathering such huge momentum right now, because we have to act. People talk about the climate crisis, with COP26 coming up this year, potentially a really decisive year on action. We saw lots of countries last year committing to net zero goals aligned around 2050. We need to see the action plans that we actually can see a transition pathway. The UK government last year, so going into the autumn, we had the statements around what a green future looks like here, and the 10-point plan. At the budget just a few weeks ago, we announced the first UK Green Gilt that will be issued in the summer. These are incredibly important steps forward in delivering those more sustainable outcomes. The data gaps are significant. They're improving every day, but we have to push for further disclosures, and some of the sort of frameworks that are being considered now will clearly be incredibly supportive. In Europe, there is something called NFRD, which is the non-financial disclosure requirements. That's going to make mandatory disclosure requirements at a company level. These things are enormously important in allowing asset managers to really be able to assess and understand how companies are able to navigate sustainability risks. So we are seeing improvements. There are still gaps, But again, as an active manager, one of the things that we do is speak continually to the companies we invest in to encourage them to disclose. Again, not just for disclosure's sake, but to really understand why we need that data, why it's so important to actually support our investment decision making.
Okay, great. I think there was a sort of a discussion how sort of over time this sort of ESG and investment, it's going to stop being such a two-pronged sort of approach and become sort of the only really way. Has anyone got anything to sort of add on how that has already started?
I mean, if I may start, I'll say something radical, and then I'm sure Jen and Andrew will have sort of comments. But I think in 5 years, if you invite us back, if we're lucky enough to do a good job today and get invited back,
I don't know about that.
We won't actually be talking about sustainability or ESG because it will be truly embedded into everybody's investment approach. It won't be a separate consideration. It will simply be a part of the assessment of really understanding, is an investment a good investment for the long term? Because ultimately, wherever you sit in the investment value chain, and obviously you're hearing from different perspectives, because you've got an asset owner in Jen, you've got an advisor in Andrew, you've got me representing an investment manager, and each of us will essentially just be talking about sustainability as part of our process, not being distinct or separate considerations. So that's my radical sort of 5 years out view. I might have underestimated how quickly things will move.
I guess I'd say one of the downsides you'd see is perhaps everyone has something to say about how they are ESG. So there's a lot more to sort through now, just as an asset owner, because something says it is green or climate friendly or carbon neutral, to kind of really dig under that and find out which actually is and which is just doing some marketing. So I'd say there's definitely a lot more things that consider themselves part of it. And if you see the assets under management in ESG things, it's exponentially grown over the last couple of years. And I'd say I would hope that, you know, we have largely sorted out the basics of climate within 5 years, but I think there'll always be a frontier, whatever that might be. You know, whether it's inclusion and diversity, whether it's inequality, which is not improving, it's going in the opposite direction. I think there'll always be things where people are going to be hopefully pushing the envelope, but definitely I don't think you interview any asset manager now who doesn't have something to say about them being good at ESG.
Okay.
Yeah, I just to add to that, yeah, 2025 to properly value all these externalities, it would be wonderful if we could, and I do think there's certain areas, possibly like climate change, but also kind of biodiversity is being put under the spotlight, where we will much better have standard valuation of it. I think kind of the key changes in that process will be the kind of quality of data coming out, because part of the action that I'm seeing from a lot of clients is just being able to measure the impact of these ESG decisions, ESG kind of criteria of the investments that they're making. And in the ESG metrics that we're seeing, so carbon emissions, diversity data, some companies are still managing to kind of game the system on the metrics. And so I hope in 5 years we will have got standards that actually can't be gamed, that properly reflect the value on society and in an environment. But I don't think it will be cut and dry by then. I think that will be when it's becoming integrated in a much more comprehensive way.
Okay, thanks Andrew, thanks everyone.
Jack, can I
yeah,
jump in with one sort of comment that links to that? Because in the past 6 months, I've spent a lot of my time working on a project around the new regulations that came into force just a few weeks ago in Europe. That's known as SFDR, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations. And essentially, this is at its heart really an anti-greenwashing set of regulations. So disclosures are critical to this. The UK, as a result of Brexit, decided not to import those rules. I fully expect the FCA to be coming out with its own framework really soon. I hope it doesn't sort of divert too much from what Europe has done. That just adds to complexity for for us, but also I think for sort of clients that do operate globally. But the reason I wanted to highlight that is because this gets right to the heart of both what Jen and Andrew have been saying. We're moving from an era when asset managers it's been okay, if you like, just to tell you what we're doing. And we're moving into transparency disclosures and showing you the evidence of actually what we've been doing. And I do think that some of those challenges that my other colleagues on the panel have talked about will disappear as a result of the requirements that come when regulators put in place that framework. And so I think for trustees, for UK investors, when we have that framework, I think the job is a little bit easier to be able to sift through the language that someone is using. I'm not saying it takes everything away, but I think it really will improve the situation. And I look at some of the reporting that we're developing at Schroders around that sort of quantification and demonstration. And I know that this is going to be a game changer for our clients.
Okay. Thanks for that, Hannah. Just finally, because we're running out of time, one of the final bits we thought would be good is sort of around recommendations and sort of there's additional academic studies coming out now around sort of the CFA ESG certificate, or just any sort of recommendations for our sort of viewers in relation to sort of books, podcasts, or just anything you can provide and recommend to our guests today. Free floor. So Jen, did you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think if you're already working, I think what Andrew said at the beginning is right. I mean, I certainly didn't have an ESG job when I started doing ESG stuff. So there's certainly, you'll be able to find plenty of things to do in any organization to help, whether it's stewardship, whether it's regulation, whether it's risk models. So if you're already working, I think there's lots of things you will find that you can do in the organisation you're already at. I also find now lots of asset managers offer free courses on climate change. So there's lots of asset managers who've linked up with various universities. And that's so then it's not the asset manager giving the course, it's the university giving the course, and they're kind of 6 or 10 hours. So if you can find any of those, I think that's good. And I have a few friends who've done the CFA course and really enjoyed it, which nobody said about the original CFA. I think it's not a requirement. I think you can find things somewhere across your personal life, which doesn't have to be investment, across what you do within your job without it being specifically your job or title, or other reading and learning. So a whole range.
Yeah, I guess if you're not working, there again. So I know some people who've been interested in kind of working for our company who have done the CFA ESG investing off their own bat. It does show kind of some professional interest in ESG and finance, but it's absolutely not a prerequisite. I think the wonderful thing about the ESG space is that it is such a fast developing area that very quickly you can become more knowledgeable than extremely senior people in any company. I mean, I've kind of been a prominent head of a department, whereas previously it was a small part of my role. And in a year, all the heads of my business come to talk to me on sustainability. Within 3 months they did. You can become an expert just by your passion, your enthusiasm and drive. So if you're interviewing for a new company and a part of your role will be ESG, do refer to kind of the blogs that you read. And you know, one that I think is pretty fascinating is by a guy, Tony Seba, who has a blog called Rethink X, where basically he thinks that the 20s are going to be the decade of disruption. You need to get on the train now because the ESG opportunity is going to absolutely outperform every single other part of the market. So he's very, very bullish on ESG. There's Ronald Cohen, who's written a book on impact. So that really explores the third dimension of that's upending traditional finance at the moment, the ESG impact side of things. And then I just love as well Yuval Harari, the author of Sapiens, just because he gives such a big picture on long-term trends. And I often go back to his books just to kind of understand why I got into this space. So a few recommendations, but bring them up when you're in interviews, because it just shows that you've got knowledge, that you've acted on the knowledge. Yeah.
The things that I would highlight. So when I first moved into the role, I was really keen to get sort of some of that learning and knowledge under my belt. So I opted for a programme through the Cambridge University, the Institute of Sustainability Leadership, CISL. And so I did an 8-week online course, which combined with sort of working full time, I have young children, was an enormous undertaking, but actually something I look back now and I'm so pleased to have done. It really supported my knowledge gap in those early months. A number of my colleagues have done the CFA qualification as well, and I would definitely recommend that. The CISL program was excellent, but it's quite a lot more expensive than the CFA program, and I think perhaps for many people it could come later in their careers, but you know, it was something that I found fantastic. Through that, one of the things I would definitely recommend that you're all looking at is the circular economy, and that's the principle that we look at, if you like, every stage of a sort of product or a value chain, and all make incremental changes. So one of the things I quite like is fashion. It's not sustainable at all. It's one of the worst polluting sectors. The carbon footprint is dreadful. The wastage is awful. And so what the circular economy says is, at every stage, can we do things a little bit better? So can we, when we're making our garments, use less material, or cut more precisely so we're not wasting, right to the end of the sort of value chain, where you're beginning to see in many shops recycle centres for you to return your clothes, and the company will recycle them and reuse them and create new materials and yarns. So there's some excellent, and my best recommendation is go to the Ellen MacArthur website, and this is the leading organisation on the circular economy, and I think it's so important that we consider that for every investment, but also individually it's going to give you some really good ideas of things that you can do in your day-to-day life to support that transition to a more sustainable future.
Great, thanks guys. We did have we've got a few minutes that we can just do maybe 1 or 2 questions, but I would say to anyone attending today, if you did have questions that we won't have time because we've already got a few minutes left, please do email them to me. I can see a few have come through on the chat, so I can definitely present them to the panelists and get them to sort of send their responses at sort of a later date. One of the questions that did come through was, I'm not sure whether any of you could answer this, but can you ask the panelists what they would recommend for someone who has lots of experience in corporate governance and proxy advisory services, who wants to transition to an ESG role at an investment firm? Would they need to do the CFA or make up for anything else for the lack of finance background? I think a few of you touched upon that, but is there anything you would like to sort of add for, I guess they could sort of cover different areas in terms of someone not just in that, but does want to go into sort of ESG. Do they have to start again, or what do they do to sort of differentiate?
I would have thought they'd have been able to get a role that includes some of the stewardship elements and then learn the other bits at the same time. So maybe the job would predominantly focus on stewardship, which is the obvious easy shift, and then learn the other things while they're there. And lots of, asset owners, asset managers, a huge drive on stewardship. So I would think there would be a lot of people who want someone with that experience.
Okay.
That's right. At Schroders, we've had experience of those kinds of individuals joining us, and that it's actually that stewardship knowledge and experience. So to reinforce what Jen was saying, that we've been looking to add to our team. So that direct experience is incredibly valuable. In the same way that I transitioned into sustainability, I think there's a number of things that you can do to support that sort of investment journey. And I think what we always look for in people that join Schroders is really hungry people that want to learn more, develop new skills. And so if you have that excellent knowledge on voting and stewardship and engagement, and then want to learn more on investment, and Schroders as an organisation, and I'm absolutely convinced the other panelists would say the same, that their organisations will support through a learning programme. So people at Schroders do the IMC to support at least a basic level of knowledge. Also the CFA, the other part of the programme, the formal investment side. These are excellent ways to support you, and I think if you're hungry and you want to learn more, there's a real benefit. And in the same way we've been talking about podcasts that cover just sustainability, there's a whole world out there that can support you on building your investment knowledge as well.
Okay. I'm just keen to, there's one question which came through which I thought was quite good by one of our guests. Do you see any specialisation amongst ESG professionals occurring, given the enormous area that ESG covers? I think that's quite an important question, actually.
And shall I try and give a quick answer to that? So I mean, there are a number of specialisms and also like education courses on specifically climate change. I know Cambridge do one on climate change, so does Imperial, and that's becoming an area where, due to regulation, due to the urgency of the crisis, due to better data, a lot of specialists are emerging. I think one thing that we're going to see as data gets better is a more quantitative, if I can say that correctly, quant ESG analyst coming about. So starting to make strategic asset allocation based on not just risk and return data, but also the ESG metric information. So if you are a quant and you can apply it very creatively, you're going to be in demand.
Interesting.
I'd just say it depends on the size of the organisation. So for somewhere like us, where we only have 10 people doing investment, we won't have specialist roles within ESG. But certainly, some of the big asset managers, or even some of the big asset owners, they would have a team for stewardship, a team for ESG investment, and then other areas as well. So I think it totally depends.
Hannah, did you have anything to add on that?
In terms of no, actually, I don't. Sorry, no.
Okay, no, it's all good. Look, we've come to the end of our sort of allocated time. So look, I'd like to thank everyone that attended, but also look, Jen, Andrew, and Hannah, thank you for taking your time out of your busy ESG schedules. And Andrew, it sounds like you do 10 to 14-hour days, so I'm surprised you've allowed time for us today. But look, thanks guys, and I'll send across any questions. And again, if anyone's got any follow-up questions that they would like, please do email them to me, and I'll make sure they get answered. But look, thanks for everyone's time, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Cheers. Bye.